Okay, good morning and welcome. My name is Janice Sarah, and I'm a professor of law at the University of British Columbia and principal co-investigator of the Canada Climate Law Initiative, or CCLI. I'm honored to work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples. CCLI examines the legal duties of corporate directors and investment fiduciaries in respect of their oversight of climate-related financial risks and opportunities. And our goal is to advance knowledge on effective climate governance practice. Today's conference, Connecting Canada's Climate Policy Network, comes at a pivotal time. Canadian appellate courts, prudential regulators, scientists, and investors all agree that climate change poses an existential threat. Yet the issue of how to rapidly decarbonize remains a thorny question for many Canadians. So today's discussion tries to tackle that very issue. How can we align our policy tools in all of our interests across every sector, region, peoples, and communities to achieve positive climate outcomes that protect Canadians, our ecosystems, and our economy? This discussion is opportune because, in my view, never have so many economic and societal interests been so closely aligned. I'd like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, CCLI, and our funders for their support of this very important initiative, and in particular, thank our speakers today for offering their very cogent insights. Okay, over to you, Fenner. Thank you.
Thanks, Janice. Hi, I'm Fenner Stewart. I'm also a law professor at the University of Calgary. I'll give you a brief overview of how the conference will proceed this morning. We'll have 4 sessions. 3 of the 4 sessions will be panels. After the panelists have spoke, there'll be a discussant. And then after the discussant speaks, there'll be a short period for a question and answer period. If you would like to ask the panel a question, you can use your chat function on Zoom and ask the question there. The moderator will be able to pick up a couple of those questions to ask the panelists. I said there'll be 4 sessions, and the 3rd session will be our keynote, and our keynote today will be by Professor John Burrows. So with no further ado, let's start today's conference. Javeria, could you pick up the first session for us, please?
Absolutely, wonderful. Thank you, Fenner. Hello and welcome to our first panel session today, Directions for Climate Policy. My name is Javeria Veldkamp, and I'm Director of the Canada Climate Law Initiative. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Margot Hurlbert and Celine Back. Dr. Hurlbert is the Canada Research Chair, Tier 1 in Climate Change, Energy and Sustainability at the Johnson Shayama Graduate School of Public Policy. Celine Back is founder and president of Analytica Advisors and a recipient of the Order of Merit from President Emmanuel Macron. We will also hear from Caitlin DeHollis, JD candidate at the University of Calgary in the role of discussant. Dr. Hurlbert.
Thank you, Javeria, and good morning to all. I'm really pleased to be invited here to present, and I'm addressing you from the Treaty 4 lands here in Saskatchewan and the traditional homeland of the Métis. And I'm excited to see so many attendees from across Turtle Island here. First slide, please. So I'm here today to talk to you about Canada's climate policy and its network and how it can be improved. It's really important to point out that this is a Sustainable Development Goal 13, and in the international sphere, keeping our eye on the ball. Next slide. My experience speaking to you comes partly from my work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where I tried to get my mind around the final chapter on land and climate and how to bring it all together in respect of policy. So it's really important, I realized, to think about climate policy in the entire system of policy, but also in the interrelationship that policy has with people and with land. Next slide, please. So we know climate is changing. We know that we are the cause of it and that we can change the course of climate change into the future if we act within the window of opportunity now. So we do know that if we don't do anything, our future in relation to water security, in relation to extreme events, and in relation to warming is looking dire. In the Land and Climate Report, we documented that the surface temperature over land has already risen 1.9 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. So our goal of 1.5 is looking slimmer and slimmer. So improved climate change models are strengthening the world's ambitions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So total carbon in the atmosphere is nearing saturation for 1.5 target. In fact, if we look at it as a carbon budget and what we have left to spend, we're going to expend our entire budget for greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere between 2028 and 2032. So the situation is starting to be dire and very much an existential threat. Our climate models actually show that we are on a pathway of 4 to 8 degrees warming. And to bring our climate models back into calibration with a 1.5 scenario, most of the models actually say we're going to overshoot. So we'll be more than 2 degrees warming, and that we'll have to use direct air capture or negative emission technologies in order to reduce these emissions. So next slide, please. So why is climate policy important? And this slide from the United Nations Environmental Program shows the gap in our policies from 2010 in Paris and in our current policies. There's the blue line below that, and then the significant change that we need to make in order to achieve our 1.5 degree target. So this is the standard IPCC climate change graph that shows how much more nationally determined contribution obligations that we need to make in order to achieve that 1.5 degree warming target. And the bottom graph shows that we need significant change to get to zero carbon emissions by 2050. Next slide, please. So climate policy is really important in achieving these goals. We in Canada have some really important initiatives that are ongoing that are really in line with what is going on in all other countries. So I'm showing kind of a scorecard of who's who in respect of the net zero emissions race. And you'll have been noticing that we're changing our discourse to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. So our government started this several years ago with its mandate letters to its ministers. And in November of 2020, an act was actually passed in the House of Commons, or introduced to support this initiative. So this is one of the first times that Canada has actually been taking its international commitments and legislating them into law. So before we'd said we're going to do things and we'd had policies that supported it, and now we're taking a very firm stance legislatively to achieve it. And I'm going to just make mention, I'm sure other speakers, Dr. Burrows, will be following up on this. A really important component of this is our legislation to implement the United Nations declarations for the rights of Indigenous people. So keeping an eye on that development is really important in strengthening this initiative. So Canada released a strengthened climate plan in December of 2020 with many initiatives contained in it policy-wise. And then this week, the Supreme Court of Canada is going to give an opinion on the carbon tax reference. And as constitutional law lawyers, we all know that win or lose, there will be directions going forward to how to solve this carbon emission problem. Next slide, please. So thinking of it as a system is really important. So the net zero by 2050, what does that mean? It means we need to think about everything and how it works together. So I spend a lot of late nights thinking about this and how we're going to get to net zero in all of our different sectors. So if there's something that we do poorly, it's we have our eye on one sector or one initiative thinking that it's going to be the cure-all for everything. And we've got to stop doing that if we're going to address this problem in time. So electricity and heat, wind power, solar power, these are really important. We need way more of these. But transportation, we have electric vehicles here in Saskatchewan. Electric vehicle is great, but if I'm burning coal, it's not such a great thing. Manufacturing and construction, often we don't even discuss it. And agriculture, the language around agriculture and greenhouse gas reduction isn't even existent in our country, so to speak. So we need to think about our forests, how important they are, but our industrial processes, making cement, and our building codes have to be buttressed. So we need to see how all of these policies work together. Next slide, please. So there are solutions. So this is the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices coming up with what we could do to achieve net zero. And at the top of the list, you'll see bioenergy. So growing things and using them for energy. Non-emitting electricity, electrification. But when we do this, our sources of electricity have to be clean and net zero. And we need to consider the entire supply chain. Canada has released a hydrogen strategy, and it's very exciting if you're here from Saskatchewan and Alberta to think about the opportunities that that strategy is giving to our businesses and our industries. So next slide, please. So this is from the Land and Climate Report, and really it's getting at the fact that growing forests is really important. This is a Canadian advantage that we need to keep our eye on. Carbon capture and storage, Elon Musk is in the news today supporting this. We have this. Bioenergy is cyclical, so it's really circulating, but bioenergy with CCS is actually the negative emission technology that we are able to do, leveraging our forests with our current carbon capture storage. Direct air capture, we actually do have these types of initiatives around the world, but they're very expensive. Next slide, please. So what are the policies that are going to support this going forward? And these are a network of policies that we need to think of and join together. So instead of thinking about oil and gas as one industry, we need to see its interconnections with other industry. And I took the top right article out of the Globe and Mail just this past weekend, thinking about how do we invest in clean tech? Who's doing it and what could we do better? So the United States has a Q45. It has a tax exemption, a tax write-off for businesses that are actually investing in clean technology. Canada could have more policies supporting this type of innovation and making sure we're on that cutting edge of innovation and able to deliver it. In Alberta, they have a carbon trunk line. So we actually take carbon out of industrial processes and we ship them to places that can use carbon as an asset. And if not used and when used, can actually put it into our underground storage where we document that it actually stays there. Next slide, please. So we need to think about this on the home level of what our homes will look like into the future with our electrical vehicles and a generation source close to us that's actually emitting clean energy, the battery storage that our appliances and our vehicle gives us overnight to actually store this energy when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. We also need the transmission to bring hydroelectricity into Saskatchewan, into the places that don't have hydroelectric resources. Next slide, please. Important focus has been on financial disclosures. So our Canadian Mark Carney is very key in developing and implementing the disclosure of climate-related plans, climate-related risks in Toronto TSE stock listed companies. And I think people around this table have some really great experience to share in regard to this. Next slide, please. Agriculture is something really important in respect of climate change and the risks that we're facing. So this is a Canadian slide showing agriculture and how soil is actually such an important sequestration of carbon for our atmosphere. So our agricultural industry, we need to start thinking about accountability, verification, and reporting of greenhouse gases in respect of our agricultural enterprise. So what is the carbon that I am eating on my plate? Am I eating local food, or am I eating food that's been transported from various areas of the world? So we don't yet have those accounting, verification, reporting mechanisms to know whether our food security is clean. We also need to keep our eye on the risks of El Nino and La Nina events that might happen with cascading impacts and food failures throughout the world, and what this is going to do, not just in Canada, but internationally. Next slide, please. So it's really important to think about the interrelationship of certain policies that we don't even really think of. Usually, we don't frame them in the sense of climate change, but they're actually really, really important. So we had a shelter belt policy for decades here in the prairies. And what it was a policy that provided incentive for agricultural producers to have tree belts. And it was a solution to the 1930s drought, but it also resulted in soil carbon sequestration and keeping that carbon in our soil and keeping our soil healthy, which prevents desertification. And it also is a form of mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gases. So one would never think that that small policy had such impact. So that's just one example. And there's so many policies that go into the land and climate connection that are important. Responding to drought, responding to flood. If we have policies and practices in place, we're actually able to save our soil and save its sequestration processes. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end with this slide because we are a bunch of lawyers, and I'm focused a lot on policy, but not to forget that the law actually offers us so many opportunities to rethink how we're standing on the precipice here of the Anthropocene. If we think about how we practice, how we teach, and how we do law. So how is the space of law? How do we think about law's application, law's jurisdiction, and law's standing? So we think of our local land planning, which is provincial, but we need to think about how our provincial laws also inform our land use of our federal laws, and then how those feed into the international laws if we're joined together in respect of planet and so our idea about law and space, whether it's through it's about the expansion into the time and the thinking of the first we have I think that was a really good way to give me the, I'm almost done here. So I'm going to end with that and the expansion of this whole idea of law into the time of the Anthropocene as this opportunity for us around here as lawyers and legal practitioners and people interested in the law to start addressing the climate policy into the next century. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can I just do a sound check? Can we please, if you can't hear me, so please someone raise the matter in the chat because we had a bit of a sound issue a few minutes ago. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm not a lawyer, but I've thought about the great capacity that lawyers have. Just looking at the last slide that Margot presented us just a moment ago, to start with first principles, and to have the ability to consider policy from a foundational basis. And I think just given the nature of the size of the Canadian policy environment and the size of the task that we have in front of us, we are going to all have to be almost like Swiss Army knives, right? We're going to have to be able to flow into different policy areas, at any given time, because there are going to be many different things happening at any given time. So I'm going to speak about the EU right now, although I start the presentation with a quotation from President Biden, and we'll follow very much along the lines that Margot has started us on. So I'm going to speak about three things, if we go to the next slide. And that is just very briefly framing, and with a slight sort of enrichment to what Margot has just referred to, IPCC 1.5 degree scenarios. And then I'm going to speak about the EU and work that I'm doing at the moment, because I'm actually speaking to you from Madrid, where I am in Spain because of the pandemic, for family reasons. But it's given me the opportunity to work deeply on a number, in the private sector, on EU-related matters. And I think, and the reason why I want to present this to you is because there's so many things that we can leverage from what's being done here, and that we will need, because there'll be so much to do in such a short time, and we can only be Swiss Army knives to a certain extent. So let's just start. If you skip forward one slide, go to the next one. I wanted to just bring consciousness and awareness to the fact that not all 1.5 degree scenarios are the same. And in the IPCC 1.5 degree special report, there were 4 illustrative scenarios. Two, the first two on the left side at the bottom of this slide, which have very small overshoot, and 2 that have very large overshoot. Or large and then very, very large overshoot. And it's not often discussed, although I think we've all we're settling around this language of net zero by 2030, but there are many different discourses around this, and some of them are based on a much more precautionary approach, which are the first 2 scenarios, which with hardly any overshoot, which means that we have to do very, very little reverse combustion. And some scenarios are predicated on very different degrees of overshoot. And to give you an example, the Sustainable Development Scenario at the International Energy Agency, when I spoke with one of the modelers during the Madrid COP, she said that it contemplated basically reverse combustion of the scale of 1/3 of what the annual emissions are today, 15 gigatons. That is an enormous amount of reverse combustion. So I want us to bear in mind that that a precautionary approach would not have us go way over 2 degrees and then have to come back, and that many scenarios that we see being referred to in the private sector are in fact based on those assumptions. I won't explain the next slide, because I think Margot has given us a good breakdown of it. So if you want to just briefly go to the next slide. Those of you who don't yet look at the Climate Action Tracker's thermometer, it's a nice, easy way of conveying many different things. Obviously, many of you will know that there was a first tally of all of the commitments, to greater ambition in preparation for COP in Glasgow, and that we're at -1% of emissions by 2030, which is a very long way from 50%, which is the milestone which we're working towards in order to be able to get to net zero by 2050. So the 50% reduction by 2030 is the emerging standard, both in the private sector and for governments. And we're a very, very long way from that. And you can see the current policies have a range of between 2.1 and 3.9 degrees, with pledges and targets in a range that's slightly tighter than that. Okay. If you just skip through one more slide, go to the next one. I'm going to speak very briefly about the stimulus which the EU has put forward. This is, I guess, two parts. So there is the 750 billion euro next generation facility, of which 30% must be dedicated to reducing emissions. And a similar, the same ratio is also applied to the $1.1 trillion multi-annual financial framework. Here in Spain, 140 billion euros of that 750 billion will come to Spain because of its particular economic circumstances. 70 billion of that will be for basically grants, with the remainder in loans. And the timing of the stimulus is for the 2021-2024 period, with a significant element of it that is being driven by the private sector in order for there to be a multiplier effect, where one public dollar would bring with it between 3 and 4 private sector dollars. So the market for clean technology, low carbon technology is obviously being opened up. That obviously that will have an important effect globally. I moderated a panel yesterday with the commissioner, the European Commissioner of the Economy, Paolo Gentiloni, and he basically said, well, we're so glad we did this because we have a first mover advantage, because obviously the US is moving in this direction as well. Next slide, please. The next generation funds are being dispersed along 3 major axes. And here again, we see, building on Margot's points, an integration of climate policy through the European Green Deal, of digital policy, which is really seen as the sort of the twin transition. So the energy transition and the digital transition are seen as going together. And then an economy that works for people. And so there's a very clear emphasis on next gen investments being focused where jobs need to be created. So an obvious focus on clean energy, renewable energy, retrofits to buildings, sustainable transportation, and energy infrastructure. None of this is news to any of you. These are all themes which are common across the world, but this sort of three-legged stool being the foundation for this macroeconomic stimulus, I think is quite innovative, and I expect that we'll see something very similar from the US when that time comes too. If we go to the next slide, at a sort of broader level, these are all of the sort of policy areas of the European Green Deal. I won't take us through all of them. The slides will be available. We can, if you have questions, we can talk about any one of these that you'd like to. But just imagine, there are dozens of people at the European Commission working on each of these policy packages. They have their regulatory implications as well. They're being called upon as experts to evaluate the national plans for the next generation funds and specific projects. Large hydrogen projects, for example, will come to individuals who are working in different parts of the EU Commission on all of these files. Why is that worth mentioning? Well, because frankly, we should beg, borrow, and steal. Whatever it can be used from these policy initiatives underway. I think we should look at them and decide, does this serve us? If it does, why start from nothing, right? Because there's a lot of consultation that's already occurred. The scientific and academic work has occurred. The evaluation of the innovations has already occurred, and the economic multipliers and opportunities are often already there as well. So lots of resources and opportunities. On the next slide, I just wanted to walk through the innovation dimension. It's something that I worked on for many years, in clean technology and understanding the opportunity for clean technology as an economic sector. The digital transformation I mentioned. Those of you who work in innovation, Horizon Europe, I think its budget has been increased now to over $100 billion. If you have in your gift to create a partnership with the European Horizon Europe facility, I would very seriously look at that as an opportunity, because there is going to be a significant focus on targeting that money towards the twin transitions, and obviously with a view to social impact. So lots of partnerships, lots of focus on emerging and disruptive technologies, but also the opportunity for the low carbon economy to compensate for the jobs that will be lost due to digitalization. So it's basically a bargain, right, between the dampening effect of technology on jobs and the growing effect of clean energy and the Green Deal on jobs in a positive compensation way. Next slide, please. I felt it important just to mention what the scope and scale of the Just Transition mechanism is for Europe. It's a $100 billion facility. Obviously, a big part of that is for Poland and Hungary. Some of the delays in the final political agreement around the Next Generation Fund was haggling around the Just Transition contributions to Poland and Hungary. That's been resolved. Again, there are important policies that have been established. There are resources that we can leverage and take the benefit of if that is something that is still in our priority for us to continue to develop, or to the extent that it's done and dusted, then that's fine too. I'm just going to close with reference to the regulatory environment and what our current open EU regulatory packages. If you go to the next slide, it'll give us an idea of just what's going on, right? So there's a new road transportation package, which for alternative fuel infrastructure, standards for both heavy duty vehicles and light duty vehicles, as well as an EU weight and dimensions package for road transportation. There's the Trans-European Transportation Network package, which is specific to intermodal transportation. There's a huge shift here towards rail transportation for people and for merchandise. There's the EU Maritime package, which is going to contemplate greater, inclusion of the maritime sector within the European emissions trading system. Excuse me, and then also the refuel aviation package. So those are all of them live today. And on the next slide, there are a number of others. The renewed sustainability strategy, continued work on sustainable finance, which is sort of the next step after disclosure and the TCFD. So the sustainable finance taxonomy is vitally important, because it's going to give savers the right to understand the degree to which their investments are in fact aligned with their priorities and preferences. For all of this to work, state aid needs to be reformed, because obviously, to the extent that we're putting $750 billion on the table, and some of it is going to the private sector, then state aid needs to be considered so that we don't get offside of the WHO. The carbon markets are going to be reformed, and that, of course, will affect the three industries that they are primarily focused on right now: steel, chemicals, and fertilizers. So that's I guess a very whirlwind tour of the policy environment in Europe. If you go to the next slide, I took this quote from Ursula von der Leyen, who is of course, the president of the European Commission, and she said this in February when the negotiations around the Green Deal were happening before the pandemic. And I think it applies to all of us. Those who act first and fastest will be also the ones who grasp the opportunities of the ecological transition. But public finances alone will not be enough. We'll need to tap into private investment by putting green and sustainable finance at the heart of our investment chain and our financial system. That is, I think those are words to live by. And I'm just going to end with a question, which is this for us to consider over the course of this wonderful conference, right? Which is, how can the work of the Climate Policy Network ensure a precautionary approach to 1.5 degrees at the intersection of policy, civil society, and business. I've given us, I guess, a sense of the policy and business side of things here in Europe at the moment, and I look forward to a broader discussion about how that intersection with civil society can really advance our aims. Thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. My name's Caitlin DeHolis, and I'll be the discussant for this panel. First, I just wanted to say thank you both so much for your presentations. Dr. Hurlbert, I was surprised that the federal government of Canada has only recently, for the first time, actually legislated on its international commitments to climate change. And it was really interesting to see the different policy pathways that Canada can take to achieve our targets under the Paris Agreement. Ms. Back, it was really great learning a little bit about the European Union's plan in addressing climate change. And I think I agree, it's really important to see how we can improve our own policies by looking at these other approaches. After listening to your presentations, I was wondering if either of you could make one change to Canada's climate policy network to help get Canada on track to meet its obligations under the Paris Agreement, what would it be?
Margot, you go ahead.
Oh, Margot, maybe, I think is your screen frozen? Celine, would you like to go ahead? I think Margot's screen may be frozen.
Yeah, I mean, if I could do one thing, it would be to make more accessible the consultation process that occurs at the level of the framework and the plan, and then in regulation and all of the steps that happen within the policy environment. I would like to make that process more accessible to civil society and to the private sector, but particularly to the private sector instantiated in companies that are much smaller than those that can normally afford to participate in the policy consultation process. I made a specific recommendation, or I had an idea which I made in, I think, 2015, which was to create a small, modest fund where small companies with innovative solutions who are being successful because of regulation in another country that is more advanced than our regulation, that they could receive a grant to pay for half of the cost of a policy benchmarking study that civil society would conduct, or the academics and or ENGOs would conduct on their behalf. And so the private sector would pay, let's say, $20,000 for this benchmarking to occur, and there would be a grant in addition, maybe for another $20,000 to have this benchmarking occur, and that all of those benchmarks would be published and would cause us to reflect on the fact that our regulation isn't world class. Why is that?
Thank you, Celine. Margot, do we have you back with us?
I seem to be back. Sorry, I seem to have an internet issue going on here, dropping in and out. What would be the one change? Is this my question that I am on?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I really agree with Celine and the great comments and support that. I think from my perspective, I know I ended with law, which always seems dogmatic. I think the conversation is the most important thing in building this worldview that we need to address climate change, this responsibility-based thinking that I think is essential to inform our practices and thereby inform the laws that we're prepared to live by, and that would address climate change. So I truly believe that every person has a seed within them of knowledge about what we can do to be sustainable into the future. And we need to nurture and grow that in every single person, whether they're working in healthcare or they're working at a cement plant, or we have a pipeline cement steel factory here next to me, but everybody really wants this success of addressing climate change. So it's having the conversation so that people can start acknowledging and accessing that knowledge of how to build a net zero society into the future.
Thank you, Margot. And thank you, Caitlin and Celine, for your very comprehensive presentations and the discussion at the end. We have a few minutes now. We have a few questions. I've kind of grouped them into topics. There was a question around culture. I think you began to address that, Margot. The question was, you know, we're focusing a lot on technology, but how do we move the needle on culture? And I think you began to address that there. So I will move on to a couple of the other questions. One is around the incentives. And Celine, you referenced the EU level of government support. I think you were quoting trillions of euros in your presentation. So the question is posed about the level of government investment, or sort of the corollary to that, the cost of carbon that might be necessary to get projects off the ground in Canada. So would either of you care to comment about that, whether referencing carbon capture and storage or specifically tax credits that you started to talk about, Margot?
Do you want me to go first? Sure. Yeah, like finance is so very important. So we have a couple maps the federal government has developed around technology. Hydrogen technology I mentioned. There's also a small modular nuclear reactor roadmap that Canada has developed. And both of these are really important because they're building on our network of people interested in solving climate change. And I know it's back to technology, but technology is really a key component when you consider the sectors that are emitting greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just practices, but it is also the technology that will allow us to keep our economy going, but address climate change into the future. So what we don't have is the financing available. The tax on carbon going up to $170 is actually going to make a significant difference in making carbon capture and storage viable, because the price of emitting carbon becomes a disincentive. So the price of putting money into solving that emission problem and avoiding the tax becomes more important to industries here in the prairies, for sure.
Thank you, Margot. And Celine, some lessons from...
So over the hump of having these new technologies and new practices.
Thanks, Margot. You cut out towards the end there, but I think there are lots of examples that you've cited. And Celine, I know that you've also produced a paper on what this might look like in terms of investment for Canada.
Yeah, so the Build Back Better plan, you know, makes very specific recommendations on what investments would be needed when, in order basically to solve for carbon, right? And it's about $100 billion plan. If you compare it to the EU plan, I think it's only about a third in terms of on a GDP, you know, equal basis. So we were very what's the word, parsimonious, right? When we were thinking about the financing of this. I mean, Canada has decided that that a carbon levy is the way we're going to do it. I think that the sector by sector approach that the UK has taken is having an impact. The decision to put basically $600 billion on the table over the next 6 years, you know, specifically targeted at enabling the transition. It's one of the largest bet in the history of any kind of finance, right? You know, again, you know, Commissioner Gentiloni this week spoke about how this is a historic decision on the part of the EU, and that the financing of this of the Next Generation Fund, using in part, you know, with a $300 billion climate or €300 billion climate bond, is a historic decision. I think it's going to work. I actually, I'm a believer in this. The Canadian policy environment is such that we have chosen not to take this approach and are using a carbon levy instead. So, I think both have been grounded in deep study and in very, very, robust analysis. But I think there is something about human nature, which, and we do have research that's been done on this as well, where we may have trouble having the carbon levy actually reach the price that we know it needs to reach. So there's a balanced view, I guess, on finance.
Thank you, Celine, and thank you for, this is what today is about. I think we will get into a lot more of the questions that we didn't have time for right now, questions starting to get into which policies will have that political support. So hopefully we can come back to that throughout the day. But thank you, everybody, for, thank you, Celine, thank you, Margot, thank you, Caitlin. That concludes our first panel. So I would now like to move us into our second panel for today, a model of Canadian climate governance. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Tammy Onefidai, International Doctoral Fellow and Vanier Scholar at the Allard School of Law. We will also welcome back Dr. Fenner Stewart, a Canadian climate governance expert at the Canada Climate Law Initiative and Associate Professor of Law at the University of Calgary. And in the role of discussant for panel 2, we will hear from Charlotte Wu, JD candidate at the University of Calgary. Tammy, over to you.
Thanks, Juvaria. So Fenner and I are presenting a model of Canadian climate governance. So I focus on the first step, developing a model of Canadian climate governance. My presentation is specifically on the theoretical framework of that model. I ask, so how should we think about Canadian climate governance? In other words, how do we make sense of the multiple governance actors and initiatives in the climate policy space? So to create the theoretical framework, I start from what we are more familiar with and then move to what we're less familiar with. So most people, whether researchers or not, are more familiar with state governance and less familiar with non-state governance. We know governments control our lives through policy making, but we do not pay much attention to how non-state actors and individuals shape policy. So political scientists think of state governance more in terms of government. Economics talk about how governments control markets. Lawyers think more in terms of law. All these professionals agree that government is at the center of state governance. Like state governance, people also think of non-state governance in various ways. So for instance, Eileen Ostrom calls it polycentric governance, Julia Black calls it centered governance. Several scholars lump various types of non-government governance under the umbrella of new governance. So I do not get into this debate about terminologies. Rather, I'm interested in how these contributions could guide our thinking about Canadian climate governance. So what I like to do now is to bring out the distinguishing elements of a theoretical framework of Canadian climate governance by contrasting the model of state regulation with the model of non-state regulation. Next slide, please. So there are several models of state governance, but I adopt responsive regulation as my baseline model. It is an enhanced model of state governance, and Harris and John Braithwaite developed that model. You can see the pyramid on the screen. So I'm using this model because it's one of the clearest and most influential in climate policy. It has informed climate policy in Australia, Canada, Europe, across international organizations and beyond. The model has three main elements. One, hierarchy of sanctions. The second one is tit for tat. Then the third one is tripartism. They use this regulatory pyramid you see on the screen to explain this element. So the first one, hierarchy of sanctions, simply means increasing severity of coerciveness in the enforcement of regulatory standards. So if you look at that pyramid, you can see that it moves from the least coercive to the most coercive. For instance, a regulatory agency can first try to persuade a regulated entity such as a corporation, to meet emissions mitigation standards, or for instance, to pay carbon tax, if that corporation is known to abide by regulations. If the corporation is stubborn, the regulatory agency can move to criminal penalty, that is moving up the scale. And in the worst case, revoke its license. That's the one at the top of the pyramid. So the second element, tit for tat, flows from that first element, the hierarchy of sanctions. So using my example of a regulatory agency versus the corporation, you'd notice that the severity of the sanction depends on how the corporation behaves. If the corporation is stubborn, again, I say, then the regulatory agency reciprocates with a more serious sanction in the hierarchy. In other words, the regulatory agency responds to the corporation in the form of tit for tat, or what we call do me, I do you in Pidgin. The third element, tripartism, is based on the idea that regulatory agencies cannot do a thorough job of regulation on their own without the help of a third party, usually members of civil society. For this reason, third-party entities such as citizens, NGOs, scholars could help across the hierarchy of sanctions. Still using that same example of regulatory agency versus corporation, if the regulatory agency wants to impose some serious sanctions up that scale, it can use the pressures mounted by individuals, NGOs, and other members of civil society as an excuse to escalate up the regulatory pyramid. Even going further, although responsive regulation does not say much about regulation by civil society or by individuals, NGOs and other private actors can actually help with some sanctions. So for instance, suing to enforce civil penalty or reporting breach to trigger warning letters or license suspension, still on that pyramid. They can also address the important climate justice dimension across that pyramid. Next slide, please. So now that I've explained how responsive regulation works as a model of state governance, what I'm really saying is that we should think about Canadian climate governance not in terms of responsive regulation, but rather in terms of network governance. Network governance is a model of non-state governance in that it does not rely on the state or the sanctions of the state. I choose it because it adequately captures the interactions of actors in Canadian climate governance. Responsive regulation or any other form of state regulation for that matter may force us to have a myopic view of Canadian climate governance. But network governance is more holistic. Let me use the three elements of responsive regulation to show why. So first, unlike responsive regulation, network governance is not built on hierarchy of sanctions, tit for tat, and tripartism. I can break that down, but on that network governance, there are several state and non-state actors interacting in infinite ways. If you look at that picture on the screen, there's so many actors there and they are interacting in various ways. So let's start from the first one. I'm more interested in the implications, right? Not other aspects of the comparison. So first, hierarchy of sanctions. While there may be hierarchy of sanctions from government to regulated entities in network governance, other actors disrupt this hierarchy through their multiple interactions with governments and regulated entities. Therefore, we should pay more attention to those multiple interactions of actors and instruments, not just sanctions from government to regulated entities. Then second, tit for tat. Unlike responsive regulation, where government responds based on the stimuli triggered by the regulated entities, again, other actors disrupt this response. As a result, we should be more concerned about the stimuli from and behavior of multiple interacting actors, instruments, and initiatives. Then three, tripartism. Network governance does not rely on just three parties suggested by tripartism: regulator, regulated entities, and third parties. Rather, there are multiple actors, instruments, and initiatives. For instance, Indigenous nations in Canada are not necessarily covered by tripartism. Therefore, I propose that we seek to synergize the contributions of those multiple actors, instruments, initiatives, regimes, the collective of what I call regulatory pathways, to get a full picture. So next slide, please. Having discussed the three key distinguishing elements that should inform how we think about network governance, I'd like to wrap up with some of the features in the literature. How does network governance operate, right? The leading work identifies 4 features of network governance. First, the participants in network governance are select, not random or necessarily entire sectors or industries. 2, second, there is consistent participation, not just accidental participation. Third, as the select participants consistently work together, they develop structured relationships. We begin to see patterns in their relationships. Fourth, eventually the participants create implicit or open-ended contracts or agreements, relationship and work. Although some may have formal contracts, this is not a requirement. So far, there is a pattern of what they agree on when working together. Thanks for your time. I'll now pass things to Fena. Fena.
Thank you, Timmy. Yeah, it's always great. Tammy was a master's student of mine who's becoming a star very quickly, and it's always I'm so proud of the work that he does. So thank you for attending the conference this morning. This conference is the first phase in a project to better connect Canada's climate policy network. And this session that we're doing this morning, Tammy and I, is to provide some theoretical models for what this network looks like. So to better connect this network, this project will map it. And to map it, we will need to start with a theoretical model as to try to get an initial understanding of what the circumference of this network looks like. One strong candidate to be a guide or part of the guide for this mapping is the topic of my presentation this morning, multiscalar governance. Next slide. So what is the first thing that comes to mind to most people when we think about making climate policy? Next. Well, that's public policy through government action. When we think about policy, we usually think about that's something that is the domain of government and something that government does. Next slide. So what are some of the actions government takes to mitigate climate change? So what is the circumference of climate change action that the state does take? So government options include, next, command and control action. Next. So command and control action can be establishing and enforcing objective rules with little room for interpretation. So for instance, the government could set regulations that establish technologies that can and cannot be used. Examples of this could be that you could only use electric cars, or that particular processes would have to be used in order to, say, make concrete. Or government action through command and control regulation could set a ceiling on the amount of GHG emissions allowed, just hard ceilings on that. So that's one form of government action. The next is financial action. And next, financial action is the sort of basket of actions that the government can take, which gives benefit to those who act as targeted. For instance, the government can create assistance programs that help particular businesses get off the ground. It can grant subsidies to particular actors within industries. It can offer direct investment into particular technologies or ideas, and it can give tax breaks. A third option for government, next slide please, is market-based action. Next. So market-based action is similar to financial action, but it's different as well. This sort of action tries to regulate risk or profit to change the behavior of market actors. So by making something riskier or making something less risky or making something more or less profitable, the theory is that it will drive the market behavior. So for instance, creating carbon prices creates a particular type of pressure in order to avoid emitting carbon. Establishing preferred customers. You see this with using renewable energy first, like Alberta's power pool does this, before carbon intensive fuels are used for the production of electricity. And another example is de-risking private investment by, for instance, guaranteeing loans. Next slide, please. What is a policy network? So the suggestion is that a policy network is more than just government. It consists of actors, which may be public or private, that are making decisions. And what connects these actors? Next, please. It's the central connection each actor has to the other is that it has an interest in the same policy space. Now, they may not be communicating to each other, but they all have a similar interest. And next slide, please. By making decisions within this space, they cooperate or compete to influence policy in a particular direction. Next slide. So what does it mean for a policy network to be a form of multiscalar governance? Well, it means that the policy space has multiple scales, think layers, from which decisions are made. So next, please. So scales are based on where the policy actors are situated in society. The literature suggests actors will come from one of three different places: government, industry, or civil society. Next. Thus, government does not control policy outcomes alone. Industry and civil society play important roles too. Next slide, please. So, but there's a problem. So Canada provides a need for special consideration when attempting to apply this model. As we move towards greater Indigenous self-government and a model of multinationalism within Canada, questions emerge. Next. What about Indigenous policy actors? Next. Does a new scale need to be created? Next. If yes, how does it function? Next. If no, then how do Indigenous actors map onto the existing model? Are they government? Are they industry? Are they civil society? Does the function of the Indigenous actor define what space it takes? But if you do that, does that blind the model to the indigenousness of those actors? And if on the other hand, you create a separate scale, what does that say about Indigenous actors as government actors? So there's many questions that need to be answered as to how this multiscalar governance model that I presented to you today could be modified in order to be adequate to reflect what Canada's climate policy network looks like. In large part, these questions need to be answered by Indigenous voices. Luckily today, one of the leading Indigenous voices in Canada, John Burrows, is our keynote speaker this morning. So I'm going to leave that, some of these questions for us to consider while we listen to the keynote presentation later this morning. Next slide. So with that, I have presented one theory that could be part of the larger theory that we use in order to guide the mapping process of Canada's climate policy network. I've described what that governance model looks like generally, and the key challenge to applying it in the Canadian context. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charlotte Wu, and I'm the discussant for this panel today. I just want to begin by saying thank you to both of our panelists for their informative presentations. What I find very interesting about your presentations is the connection between networks and climate policy. Examining these networks and connections within them exhibits an approach that places the responsibility of climate policy on multiple parties. I think that sometimes climate policy is approached as an issue for the government to handle exclusively through command and control action, market-based action, and financial action. However, from your presentation, it is easy to see how a multiscalar network approach enables industry and civil society to have a role in determining policy outcomes. It's enlightening to see how groups from various sectors in society work together, compete, and influence each other in creating policy in systems like the alternative non-state governance model. This presentation also made me consider the way in which networks interact with Indigenous groups in Canada. I found it compelling that this presentation addressed the challenges that arise when collaborating with Indigenous groups in climate policy. After listening to this presentation, I have a question for you both. What are the advantages and disadvantages of employing the theory of multiscalar governance as a guide for mapping Canada's climate policy network?
Why don't you go ahead, Timmy, and start.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks so much, Charlotte, for that question. So there's a lot of work, a mountain of literature on this. So I'll rely on the leading scholars, Tiffany Morrison, Ariosovsky, and Jacqueline Peel to answer the question. So the basic idea, just because of those that may not really understand, basic idea of multiscalar governance that these scholars share is that governance at one scale, whether that's across levels, local to international, or across domain of actors, whether civil society, industry, or whatever actor. So the idea they share is that governance at one scale impacts and is impacted by governance at other scales. So since Fen I talked about the actor domains, I'll focus more on the levels, the international, the local to international. So let's start with the disadvantages. They are more popular in the literature, with Tiffany Morrison making a leading contribution on that. So we have also seen them in policy and practice. So one, governance efforts at one scale may undermine those at other scales. So for instance, governments and other stakeholders have made efforts to tackle climate change at the global level, but we know that national policies have undermined that effort. So for instance, Canada and the US are pulled out of the global climate regime at different times. Two, multiscalar governance is difficult to manage, right? So there is nothing like a multiscalar government or a world government. Countries have something they call sovereignty, right? Which gives them the right to do whatever they like within the borders, at least to a large extent. There are qualifiers to that. So how then do we coordinate the numerous governance efforts at multiple scales? Although intergovernmental organizations and regimes such as the UNFCCC system are making efforts, they also have their shortcomings. So now let me move to the advantages of multiscalar governance. So one, we can harness the multiple governance efforts and skills to create really interesting governance arrangements. So for instance, the European Union has harnessed multiscalar governance to create a largely effective continental governance system, and many have found very helpful for climate policy. There are also several ideas out there about how to harness these multiscalar interactions. Let me come back home. So home at UBC, Stephen Wood at UBC has led some foremost scholars to discuss how to harness governance interactions across scales to better regulate business and empower actors across domains, including climate policy. So the number two advantage, multiscalar governance also allows the combination of bottom-up and top-down implementation of climate policy, right? That's what we largely have in the global climate regime. We have already seen this, although there are still some challenges. To complement this global approach, Ariosovsky also suggests we should use litigation to rescale multiscalar governance. Unlike agency regulation, litigation can work better across scales to address climate change. Jacqueline Peel has also written a lot about that. So I'll stop there. Pass.
Thanks. I guess like the first thing that I would suggest is that whether like it has pros or cons or advantages or disadvantages, I don't think it's really an option to use it. It's just whether it exists or not. And it does exist, right? So this is what we have. And it's from this project, it's about what does it really look like? So the advantage of using this model or another model, the general disadvantage is that it's a model. It's a theory and it generalizes a lot of nuance and it doesn't accurately describe what is actually occurring. Or if it does so in such a general way as to make it very limited in terms of its usefulness. But what it can do is it can lead to the next step. And that next step is to actually go out into the field, usually using interviewing and to map the actual circumference of what we're talking about. How active is civil society? What are these actors? What connections do they have with industry? What actions do they have with government? What does the overlap look like? How responsive is government regulation to the calls of civil society? How responsive is industry to regulations? Do they follow the regulations? Do they not? Do they say they do? Do they not? These sorts of dynamic dimensions of a real policy space is what most of the literature says now is that, the models get us so far, but what you really need to do is to have a geographer who can map these spaces, which luckily Margot is actually it has a PhD in geography, and hopefully she'll be helping us out in other phases of this project. But with that, yeah, so that would be the advantages of disadvantages. I don't think it's like an optional thing. It's more like what's actually occurring and how do we better understand what it looks like.
Thank you. And thank you, Charlotte, for the thoughtful question. Thank you again to Tammy and Fenner for your very insightful presentations. We have some time now for some questions, which I'll pick up again. Thank you, Fenner, for tying it back to the panel one discussion as well. We started to talk about, let's talk about the questions sort of fall into three categories again, but one is around the international context. So I think, quite rightly, we have a Canadian policy discussion today. But some of the questions apply to how this would relate to trade as well as global climate justice. So for example, Tammy, you mentioned the tit for tat model, as well as a network model for climate governance. How would both of you say this maps to trade, for example, when it comes to carbon border tariff adjustments?
Do you want to start, Timmy, or do you want me to?
Please go ahead. I may address the climate justice one.
Okay. In a general sense, what I find, so I'm going to answer the question in a very indirect manner. What was amazing about the Paris Agreement is that the international community could agree on anything. That is a huge, if you think about international coordination between actors, especially public international actors, it's very difficult for public international actors to agree to anything. Terms that you would think would be pretty non-controversial, such as what a genocide is or is not, you would think they would be able to agree to. They don't do that. So the fact that so many countries could get together and agree to particular targets and set national commitments, even though they're not doing a very good job, there's a commitment gap presently, and that's part of the problem. It's good that we can get to that level. So when you start talking about expectations of public actors at the international level and what level of expectations we should have about what they can achieve internationally, I think that says a lot. When you add on an additional layer of international trade to that, I find that national agendas become very politicized and they become quite entrenched in national interests, and it usually falls back to a particular technocratic narrative where they're trying to find innovative solutions to, say, grow their middle class while saving the world at the same time. And that can be somewhat problematic and unrealistic as to what the challenges that we're facing. I'm halfway through Bill Gates's new book, and he suggests that if we do nothing by 2050, we'll have an economic event similar to the pandemic every decade. And it will be largely irreversible unless we can suck huge amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere, which would also be incredibly expensive at this point. So I think that international investment in trade, there are opportunities, but I would probably pour some cold water on that. But I still see the possibility of, especially with the cost of carbon, to be able to do dynamic things with larger international economic models.
Thank you, Fenner, and thank you for reminding us of what's at stake. There was a study recently that said the Ice Age was 6 degrees cooler than it is today. So I think in terms of how degrees of warming contribute to a different planet is important to keep in mind. And Tammy, let's talk about the global climate justice angle. You know, a lot of the transition pathways discussed earlier, you know, we talk about localization of supply chains to decarbonize our economies. What does this mean for countries' trade, especially those in the global south, and how do we ensure we are not widening an income gap?
Yeah, thanks so much, Javaria. So the reason I thought I should take this one is because I've been doing some work on that. So I'm actually presenting at the USI at UBC in 2 days on climate justice, right? So I do think that the network governance model or multiscalar regulation, whichever, I think both of them give the opportunity to address climate justice. And also, like the international trade agenda that Fina talked about, it also gives room to bring that into the policy dialogue. So if you remember, right, I identified some of the features of network governance, right? Things like they have to consistently work together. They have to have some kind of implicit agreement. Now, what that means is that various actors are able to contribute to not just agenda setting, but all the phases of the policy cycle up to implementation and beyond. So what does that mean for, I think it's apparent what that means for climate justice at home, right? Because climate justice is not just an international thing, it's also a national thing, right? Indigenous peoples, they're vulnerable when it comes to climate justice. And some other people, you know, Black people and all that. Now, what does that mean for climate justice internationally? What it means, I'll borrow again from the work of Resurgence, is that certain actors can use litigation to rescale issues in climate change. So for instance, meanwhile, in regular government model, right, the regulator, you know, tries to enforce a particular regulation, they may not really take into consideration interests of international people, people in other countries, right? Because it's all about our interests at home. But imagine if in the network governance model, any of those parties, right, citizens, for instance, are able to sue on behalf of foreign indigenous peoples or foreign communities, host communities of oil companies or mining companies, right? If they are able to sue on their behalf, then that becomes part of the domestic agenda of Canada. So that's just one example. So actually recently there have been cases of successful action in places like Netherlands, so transnational litigation. So instead of suing at home, because some of these countries are not don't have strong governance systems, then people sue in the host states, or rather, actually home states of corporations. So for instance, a Canadian corporation operating in Nigeria, then they commit something in Nigeria, maybe pollution or whatever, and you sue them in Canada. So network governance gives opportunity for that, right? It's more difficult in the traditional government model. So there are other areas, but I'll stop there because of time.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you for keeping to time. I think it is a very complex discussion, but I'd like to thank our speakers for sharing very helpful models. I think models are helpful, as you said, Dr. Stewart, for thinking about the complexity of climate change, which is a systemic challenge. So thank you for your thoughts today. That concludes our second panel, and we now have a short 4-minute break before we convene again at 25 minutes past the hour, depending where you are. That's 10:25 a.m. Pacific time, and we'll join again for panel number 3 shortly. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone, welcome back to our conference, Connecting Canada Climate Policy Network. My name is Sonia Lee, and I'm the Communication Manager at the Canada Climate Law Initiative, and I'll be your moderator for the rest of the conference. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. John Burrows, who will talk about bridging Canadian climate governance to Indigenous ethics. Dr. Burrows is the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria Law School in British Columbia. He's the 2019 Molson Prize winner from the Canada Council for the Arts and the 2020 Governor General Innovation Award winner. He is Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and a member of Chippewa of the Nawash First Nation in Ontario. And he will be joined by discussant Amelia Harmon, JD student at University of Calgary. So without any further ado, I will let John the stage. John, you're on mute.
Thank you. Great to be with you, and speaking to you from Wisanich territory here in Victoria. It's the Songhees and Esquimalt lands, and I'm grateful to be able to work, play, and learn on these territories. As was mentioned today, I'm going to speak about bridging climate governance to Indigenous ethics, and this is near and dear to my heart because it implicates Indigenous law and its role in understanding how we deal with change that's around us. When I think about Indigenous perspectives on climate change or experience with climate change, I remember that there's a deep time experience that we have. Here is my territory, the Chippewa of the Nawash, the Saugeen Peninsula in Ontario. It's sometimes called the Bruce Peninsula between Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. And what you're looking at is the Niagara Escarpment. The Niagara Escarpment is a form that developed 440 million years ago when what is now Ontario was at the equator. And at that time, the area was a shallow, warm sea. And when you walk around the territory, you find evidence of that time as fossils are buried in the rocks and are just loosely at your feet as you walk along the shore. So knowing the dynamism of the earth and the movement of the earth from that time to this time is something that we're constantly reminded of as Anishinaabe people in our territory, seeing these escarpments that surround our reserve. It's also the case that within human time, within the last 12,000 years, these areas were and have been flooded as a result of glaciation and then the retreat of glaciation. And many of our recreation stories talk about that time and the challenges that we had as humans dealing with the climate changes that were surrounding us. And we have a lot of evidence of those changes, both again in our stories and in our laws, but also in the physical features of the land and waters that surround us. We've also had a lot of experience with climate change in the last 400 years. If you think about our territories and you see them paved over with cities like Toronto and Detroit and Buffalo, and you recognize the crisscrossing of roads and the replacement of forest with fields through agriculture and the placement of mines and other features on the land, you'll know that Indigenous peoples are living through and have lived through a great climate change within our human memory over the last just couple of 100 years. And of course, that is accelerating in its intensity. And so we are still living in this colonial time that is disrupting our relationship with our territories through the climate change that have been brought upon us by vast numbers of people relating differently to the lands and the waters in this area. And then of course, we also have experience with climate change within lifetimes. When I talk with my elders, they tell me about the fish runs being at different seasons, the sap coming up the trees in ways that is unpredictable, the wild rice not always being able to be in the same cycle that they were used to, maybe 40, 50 years ago. The idea of climate change in our lifetimes is also very prominent. And the point that I'm making here is that with this experience through deep time, human time, colonial time, and in our lifetimes, Indigenous peoples have made observations as about how to deal with climate change and how to challenge some of the features of difference that are coming amongst us. That is to say that Indigenous peoples have laws. And if you think about law not just flowing from parliaments or legislatures, interpreted by courts with the assistance of lawyers and judges or enforced by police, you can think about law as its functional relevance. That is, Indigenous laws function as principles, processes, criteria, measures, indicia, benchmarks, precedents, guides, intellectual and cultural resources to help regulate our affairs, to help set rules and codes for resolving disputes and making decisions. And again, that comes from these experiences of both moments of harmony that we've enjoyed with the broader world around us, but also moments of rupture, because law doesn't just come from agreement, law also comes from disagreement. Indigenous peoples having to grapple with both agreement and disagreement have functional ways of looking to these ideas on the screen here that would help us deal with these questions of climate change. Now, many Indigenous peoples have many sources of laws. Some of those laws come from that deep time and human time, 12,000 years ago, that create stories that have those principles and processes that are found in them as to how to relate to the earth. A lot of our our laws are formed through deliberation. Some of our laws are positivistic or declaratory, codes and chronicles and do's and don'ts. So some of our laws come from customary ways of interacting with one another, incentivizing behavior that's productive of good relationships and disincentivizing behavior that gets in the way of our relationships with one another and with the broader world around us. But I want to focus today on one of these sources of law, which is a little bit different than what you would find with the common law or the civil law, which is reasoning by way of analogy by looking to the earth and how the earth functions, and finding in the earth's functions opportunities for humans to either analogize or distinguish what they see happening with plants and animals and fish and insects and water and air, etc. And so we call this akinomagewin. Aki is that word there that starts on the right, which means earth in Anishinaabemowin. Aki is earth. No mage is to point towards and take direction from. And so that's the word for this process I'm describing, which is the earth is the legal archive. The waters contain the information that helps us understand what we as humans should be doing in our places. That is, we can see a literacy that's found in Indigenous law, in Anishinaabe law, that would allow us to read the earth through language, through experience, through stories, through deliberation, through customs, through song, through the ways that a human community would take direction from the earth that surrounds them. This is sometimes called environmentally derived law. It's sometimes called natural law, but it's not the natural law of the Western tradition. It's law that is trying to be attentive to nature as the precondition for the subsequent work and life that humans and others involve. I published a book called Resurgence and Reconciliation that made the point that there's no reconciliation with one another unless we are reconciled with the earth. Now, in taking these ideas of akinomage, when you can see on the left of the screen here, 7 words in Anishinaabemowin, these are our 7 grandmother or grandfather teachings. Anishinaabemowin is part of the Algonquian language family that goes from the Atlantic Ocean across what is now the Maritimes, Quebec, Ontario, through the prairies to the Blackfoot people. So it's a pretty broad language. And these words here indicate what I'm talking about as law is drawn from the earth. So Zigidawin, Debwewin, Nabuakawin, Manajidawin, Zungadewin, Guayakwadizawin, Dabadaindizawin. I just want to take one of these words and illustrate to you what I mean by taking our guidance from and our laws from the earth. So Zigidawin is our word for love. It is actually related to our word for river mouth, Zagin. I think you might be able to see the etymology there, Zagidawin, Zagin. Again, we're the Zagin Anishinaabe. This is the river, the Saugeen River, that flows through Grey and Bruce counties and eventually empties itself out into Lake Huron. Well, as this river flows, what it does is it captures energy off the land through the various tributaries and takes all of that microbial life and soil and nutrients, and eventually it delivers it through this channel at the mouth of the Saugeen. Now you can see how it's all dammed up here with navigation markers and boat protective areas. But if you would have looked at this site perhaps 300 years ago, you would have seen this as the richest site that you could find as you moved throughout our territory. Because at our river mouths, because of all that delivery of nutrients, you would have a lot of diversity of life that would be here. With that microbial life, you would of course have many insects living in relationship to that. And with those insects, what you often get is fish coming along and feasting on those insects. And then with those insects and fish there, you also get the birds coming along and feasting on the fish and the insects. And of course, you've got all sorts of plant life that gathers there because of that delivery of those nutrients that the fish and the insects and the birds live on. And with all the fish and birds and plants and insects, of course, you eventually get the animals moving into the territory, feasting on those plants and animal and insect and fish life. And then with that, of course, then you would have a human community that would move in and enjoy great abundance there because of that diversity of life. And so Zagin is this river mouth. Now you might understand that word Mitchazage, which is the Mississauga, which is another great river mouth down in the Toronto area, but this is about 2.5 hours north of Toronto in the Saugeen Peninsula area. So what does this have to do with law? Well, this is an illustration of what love looks like. And you can see love is blocked here by these navigational markers and these marina protected areas, because what love is it's taking energy from around your experience in life and delivering it in defined channels such as to produce an abundance and diversity and breadth of life that surrounds you. And so if you wanted to learn about love as Anishinaabe people, one of our ethics, one of our laws, one of our values, then you would go to the river and you would study the river to see what is required as human beings to be loving in the way that we would act. And of course, the idea is to try to embody this idea of Zagit, try to embody what the river does within a human form. So this is my great-great-grandpa here and his family. And he was a person that lived like a river, or lived with Zagit, he was able to collect all the goodness that was surrounding him, and he was able to deliver that in defined channels to support a wide variety of life around him. He was a chief of our community or counselor for 50 years. He had his own children. I think there were about 11, but they also adopted and fostered many other children in an Anishinaabe way, in the way that they gathered together. Now, what's happening here is Anishinaabe people are taking those 7 grandmother and grandfather principles, and they're also putting them into written form. And you can see here in this constitution, which is from the Amjimanong Nation, which is Sarnia, which is in the Chemical Valley area, just south of just north of Lake Sinclair along the St. Clair River. And this is one of 43 Anishinaabe communities in Ontario that have been trying to distill their laws, as I've been describing, in this form. I can read Ningodwe, Wangizit Anishinaabe, one Anishinaabe family, the Benjigay, Gisan, Anishinaabe, a king, Gibit the Guang, Gadane Manadu, Wadizuin, Creator placed the Anishinaabe on the earth, along with the gift of spirituality. Shkode, Nibi Akit Noden, Gibit the Gosanun, we Nagaduin Demang, Mampish Kamikong. Here on Mother Earth, there were gifts given to the Anishinaabe to look after fire, water, earth, and wind. Notice the climate is there very prominently as a part of our Constitution. The Benjigay, Giman, Minuan, Gechua, Wayne Dog, Anishinaabe, Wa, Nagadunijin, Ninda, Nijwaswit, Kinut Madwinin. The Creator also gave the Anishinaabe 7 sacred gifts to guide them. They are Zagiduin, Debwewin, Manin, Dumawin, Mbwakawin, Dabadain, Dizuin, Gwayakwadizuin, Minwa Akadewin. Love, truth, respect, wisdom, humility, honesty, and bravery. And you can read more there. And you might wonder, how can Anishinaabe law create a constitution around ideas like love or truth or respect? Aren't those too vague, too ambiguous, too broad to be able to do the work of law? Certainly they are vague. Certainly they are ambiguous. Certainly they do have huge and high aspirations attached to them. But I think if you also remember that we in Canadian constitutionalism talk about peace, order, good government, or in the Charter, we talk about life, liberty, security, equality. You also recognize that those are broad aspirations too, but through time we can give meaning to those by the stories we tell ourselves as we interpret these words through cases that come to us wave after wave as people try to hold governments to account to those principles. And for Anishinaabe people, we really are trying to do the same thing. And I hope you can see the implications that this could have for climate change if we thought about love as not just only flowing from the earth, but we also saw a love as directed to the earth. That is, how do we love the rivers, the plants, the animals, the birds? How do we develop a language, a practice, a set of laws that would have us see those obligations implemented in our lives? It's also important to note that Anishinaabemowin functions through animacy, sees the earth as living, as a relative that you can enter into communication with, not that you hear audible voices, but you understand what the earth requires, or the various components of the earth requires, by the listening more deeply to the changes, to the interaction of the different features, the way, again, this might be expressed in language. Anishinaabemowin, if you were to learn our nouns, they're gendered, but not gendered by male and female, as you might find, say, in French. They're gendered by animacy and inanimacy. And some of the things that are animate in Anishinaabe language are things that English speakers wouldn't consider as living. And so to see the earth as this dynamic, living being that has something to tell us is a part of our understanding of the climate. It's also the case that our world is very verb oriented. 80% of our words are verbs. And so when you speak Anishinaabemowin or Algonquian, you're involved in conjugation, not categorization. And so the words of law themselves are all verb words. They're things that you do and participate in. And if we thought of law itself as a verb, something we do, something we participate in, something we conjugate, then perhaps we would see there's an opportunity to take back more of those participatory elements that we could be in relationship with others in. This is our word for blueberry pie. Which means old-time Frenchman of layering berries between bread, bending over, putting those into the oven and watching them explode. In other words, our word for blueberry pie is not the noun of the pie, it's actually blueberry pieing. And so to practice law in relationship to our climate and in relationship to one another, we have to think about how do we conjugate? How do we participate with one another? How do we ensure that there's this living dimension that verbs are a part of? So that when we speak about constitutions, we're not speaking about a person, place, or thing. We're not speaking about an object. We're speaking about an activity, constituting, how we're constituted, how we engage that as an ongoing activity. And so you can see, as we put this together, we really are trying here to find Anishinaabe constitutionalism in relationship to climate and other dimensions that has this living attachment to it. Now, other examples. Here's an example from the prairies where Indigenous peoples have entered into treaties with the buffalo. And so you've got these buffalo markings here on the map. And then in orange, you see where the different reserves or reservations are across the borders. What the people are trying to do here is to see the buffalo run again from Yellowstone to the Yukon. And in this treaty, you can read about it. There's songs attached to it. There's pipe ceremonies attached to it. Buffalo have now been put into the backcountry of Banff National Park as a result of this treaty, with the hope that there can be a reinvigoration of this landscape by entering into treaties with the buffalo, recognizing that we have obligations, these people have obligations to the buffalo to bring them back from their former range, as you see here in brown, with a hope that there would be a run that would go up and down the slope there of the Rocky Mountains. Indigenous peoples have treaties with the natural world, is what I'm trying to say. Anishinaabe people, our first treaties are treaties with plants and animals and rocks and rivers and fish, deer, moose, caribou. That is, there's mutuality with those obligations to try to ensure that they have place with territory, with ability to be able to roam and run. As Indigenous peoples are then approached in relationship to development within their territories, what they're trying to do is bring their laws forward and have them become guiding in deciding whether or not there should be mining or forestry or pipelines or whatever the question might be. And here's an example from the Skeetchison and Tecumloops people, the Secwepemc people, who were making a decision about whether or not to allow a gold mine to go ahead in their territory. And you can see they gathered together in clans with families across different bands with elders, youth, family councils, and they talked about the water world, the fisheries, the flora, the fauna, the sky world, health, and then what's called indigenomics. And in so doing, they came to a conclusion in relationship to the mine, in that case, not to pursue it, whereas in other cases, they would take that path of allowing development to occur in their territory, which they've done in other instances. And you can go and see many of these examples of environmental assessments that are either being run by Indigenous peoples or Indigenous peoples are requiring when the Crown comes or proponents come to consult with them about the development and the need for accommodation. The idea is that we're trying to find places for those laws to be reflected. Of course, these are old. The potlatching systems on the West Coast here still speak to the environment in strong ways as people dance their laws with masks, with totem poles that show their relationality to the fish and the killer whales and the cedar as they try to embody that in this space. And in so doing, again, they make decisions about harvesting, about land use, about water use, about the changing world that surrounds them as a result of these opportunities. Anishinaabe people, many Indigenous peoples entered into treaties with the Crown in our earlier years to try to create this multi-juridical legal engagement. These are treaties from at least the 1760s, as people agreed with the Crown to link arms together and to support one another, because this belt here, this is a treaty here that was between the Haudenosaunee, or the Six Nations of the Iroquois, and the Anishinaabe after 50 years of war. And you can see white is the dominant theme of the agreement, which means peace. I have a copy or a replica of the belt here as well. And there's 7 rows of that white beads that are sewn into these hides, which represent the 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings again, but also represent the 7 directions: east, south, west, north, up, down, and in the center. That is, we're thinking about the entire environment in engaging with one another, in creating peace. And in the middle of that belt, you see a purple object, which represents a bowl or a dish. It means that we all eat out of the same bowl. We all eat out of the same dish. And this treaty here has a little white object in the middle, which represents when you come to eat out of that bowl or that dish, you bring a spoon. You bring a blunt object. You bring something that's not going to be threatening the life that's around you, perhaps like a knife or a fork would. Now, this treaty, of course, has significant implications for our climate, understanding that on this earth, we're eating out of one bowl, and that we need to find those pathways of peace that include love and humility and respect and honesty to ensure that we are not threatening one another, and also threatening our relations, our older relations, the clans, the animals that are a part of. Nigigan Dodem, I'm of the Otter clan. I have responsibilities in particular that flow through these clan relationships, but these responsibilities also are about learning from this animal to be able to try to act in ways that that animal does in the natural world. When my great-great-grandpa entered into a treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land in Ontario, the land that goes from Goderich on the coast of Lake Huron to Arthur in the middle of the province, and then up to Collingwood, everything north of there, when my great-great-grandpa made a treaty with those that were coming from other places to share this land, he put his Otter mark on the treaty or his otter totem. Because what he was doing is he was inviting people that were coming from other parts of the world to live in accordance with Anishinaabe law, to understand that we learn our laws and that we wanted to teach our laws to the settlers so that they would see the rivers as places of love. They would see the fish as our professors. They would see the animals as our teachers and our kin. And as we entered into treaties with one another, we kept trying to express this. Here's a treaty where we were making petitions to Washington in this case, because the Anishinaabe Nation is in Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, but also Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so when our people south of the border wanted to try to communicate with Washington, you see they drew themselves, and they didn't drew human figures, they drew themselves as cranes and bears and mer people and fish and otters and muskrats, and they made the heart very prominent in the way that they were trying to communicate. And then they connected this all through the chief here, which is the crane, and then that crane sent the message off to Washington for further clarification. I've been trying to teach about this in a joint degree now that we have here at the University of Victoria, where you teach Indigenous law alongside the common law. But I also go home quite frequently when it's not COVID times. And here you've got an example of Western University students at the Chippewa, the Zibing, that is just south of London, Ontario, learning law on the land, from the land. Also in the background there is my own community at Cape Croker, Neashi-Winnigaming, which is about 3 hours north of Toronto, where I teach law students. So 1 week McGill students come in, and then another week Osgoode students come in, and another week U of T students will come in. And then over here is an experience I had at Walpole Island, which is just outside of Windsor, with some of my colleagues there. Val Wabos, who's a law professor at Windsor. We, and with others, ran an Anishinaabe law camp in that site, trying to get people to see the climate as a part of our very being. Again, this is another picture of my reserve, just trying to show the importance of reflection, reflexivity in the way that we operate in relationship to the land. I've also taught these courses in the city. This is a course I offered at the University of Toronto Law School before COVID in January. Anishinaabe law is a part of Toronto's natural landscape. The class will facilitate student understanding of Anishinaabe law by teaching and learning about how law is reflected in natural features within the city. Reference to these sources of law is a vital resource for regulating behavior and resolving disputes. Students will hear and work with sources of Anishinaabe law found in traditional stories, the environment, treaties, declarations, customs, etc. So I took students just to the back of the University of Toronto there. There's an old river that is buried under what's called Philosopher's Walk. We talked about that as a gathering site, and I gave them a lot of Anishinaabe history in relationship to rivers again in that place. But then we looked at the cedar trees and the maple trees and the plants that were waiting for new life just outside of Hart House. We went to the anthropology building, and we saw all of the material objects that are there from the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Anishinaabe. We went to the ROM Museum. We were able to look at the treaties and able to look at some of the, again, those material objects. We went to the Massey College has a Chapel Royale, which is a chapel of the Queen in the middle of the city, but our wampum belts are housed there to recognize the relationship that we have with the Crown through our treaty processes. In other words, we don't have to just be in some pristine space to be able to understand about climate and environment and our relationality to it. You can also find this in urban spaces as well. Of course, you've probably followed the land protection movements that are going on to try to take action in relationship to climate change, to ensure that there's care given to Aboriginal rights and title, but again, also care to all the non-human, or more than human, as we often say, around us. There is a way of thinking about this in Canadian law. That is, the law dealing with Aboriginal and treaty rights is called by the court intersocietal. The court says a morally and politically defensible conception of Aboriginal rights will incorporate both legal perspectives, meaning it will incorporate both Indigenous perspectives and Crown perspectives. The court has talked about this area of law as being a bridge between legal cultures. The purpose of this law, the court says, is reconciliation. The point I'm making here is that what I've been talking about with regard to Indigenous law should be considered to be a part of Canadian law when our Aboriginal and our treaty rights are involved. And even if our Aboriginal and treaty rights aren't involved, the methodology here is a very sound methodology, which is to try to ensure that you beware the danger of a single story, that you understand that by counseling together and putting different points of view together, it's possible to have an enlarged vision with these different angles of perspective that come in. And so to think about Canadians' constitutional law as being about the earth, as I've been describing to you, could be something that could be a bridge from Indigenous law, Indigenous ethics, to thinking about climate change and action in relationship to climate change more generally. Because if it's a part of Canadian law, that means that around us are all of these communities that have these opportunities to provide insight about climate as we work on the United Nations Declaration Rights of Indigenous Peoples implementation, or agriculture and food, or species protection, mining, forestry, fisheries, water, housing, planning, habitat protection, parks, green belts, easements, conservation, capacity building, self-determination, environmental assessment, green energy, investment and trade, of course, then treaty and Aboriginal rights and title itself. Right, the point I'm making here is that this shouldn't just be regarded as a field that is ghettoized or is off to the side, but it could permeate our land insofar as Indigenous peoples are across the land already and have experience with environmental change, climate change in deep time, in human time, in colonial time, and of course in our lifetimes as well. So I'm grateful for the chance to be able to think about some of these possible bridges here and how they might relate to one another. Hope that there might be a little bit of food for thought here and understanding as we maybe pick up the implications for the remaining time that I have. So thank you again for this invitation and opportunity to speak about this. And I hope that our learning journey together will continue.
Thank you, Dr. Barrows.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. My name is Amelia Harmon, and I'm speaking from Yellowknife right now, which is the traditional home of the Yellowknife Dene and the North Slave Métis. I want to first express my great thanks to Dr. Burrows for sharing such an insightful and informative discussion today. So Dr. Burrows, I really appreciate your discussion surrounding treaties, specifically wampum belts and the dish with one spoon belt, and how it represents a bridge where everyone, including the environment, can exist with one another in peace and mutuality. And I also appreciated your point that the law is drawn from the earth and that it's more of a guided way of decision making and an ongoing process that we can all engage in, even non-lawyers. And I think your discussion ultimately highlights the importance of the need to incorporate Indigenous law and Indigenous ethics into various systems, including climate governance and policy moving forward. And so a segue to that would be a question for you of how we can better incorporate Indigenous ethics into climate governance moving forward.
Thank you for that analysis and feedback and question. I think there's no one answer as to how we best incorporate these laws, these ethics into the broader task that lies before us. That is, we need folks with different experience from different walks of life interacting in these spaces to ensure that these ideas come out. So they, of course, in economic and legal spaces, but also educational and museum and governmental spaces. And the idea here is that we have to, again, beware of the danger of a single story. understand that nuance is sacred. We have to view our policy climate as an ecosystem rather than a monoculture. And so the very kind of thing that we're hoping to see in the climate, in our environment around us, where no one say like forest is planted in a commercial way that shuts out the other possible growth that's there. So it is with the ideas in our legal ecosystem. We need to ensure that we have the fish and the plants and the grasses and the animals. That is, we need to ensure that we're speaking with different registers in different places of persuasion, including in the religious and the spiritual sphere. This is not something that can be just done through one funneled area. And again, because it's verb-based, it's challenging then because of that. But then that very challenge presents the greatest opportunity because it invites participation. It says, this isn't something that's just to be done to you. This is something that you should and can do yourself. And when you think about law in that light, I think that's much closer to our democratic aspirations. It's much closer to what we would hope to see as we try to empower our possibilities for being a participatory people, as opposed to a passive and contained peoples as a whole. And when I think about our entire population. So just to say again, nuance is sacred, and to try to take that aboard as a part of our work. I do see a couple of questions here in the chat function. Maybe I can just read one of them, since I think I have a minute or two.
Yeah, exactly.
From Jen here.
Yes.
It says, given all the incredible wealth of experience and knowledge Indigenous peoples have in relation to climate changes, how is it that Indigenous peoples are still structurally excluded from, as the forthcoming report from Indigenous Climate Action shows, from climate policy decision-making in Canada? Why are settler voices and perspectives and interests still dominant in climate policy making in Canada, despite endless promises, nation-to-nation relations, etc.? What can lawyers and legal scholars here today do to make right this ongoing procedural climate injustice? Well, part of this is the educational piece, learning about and from and with Indigenous peoples, not assuming that we know, you know what they think, coming alongside in that experiential sharing type of an opportunity. I just don't think there's an awareness at some level about Indigenous law and Indigenous relationships to ethics in regard to climate and policy change in specific terms, right? People might have a general idea, oh yeah, Indigenous peoples, they're over there thinking about the environment. But you know, we have sophisticated, deep, tangled legal frameworks and methodologies that pick up these questions that are just sometimes very weakly reflected through national fora. So for instance, the Waitangi River being recognized as a legal personality in New Zealand, you know, if we think about rights for nature or legal personality for nature, there's something positive about that, but there's also something limiting about that, because these, of course, are more than human. They are not just persons in their agency. They have another kind of agency, and Indigenous peoples have had to grapple with that. So it's a good start to try to consider what the agencies of these features around us might be. In some places we're starting to get there, but the deeper learning has not sort of set in, and we need to create processes like the environmental assessments, like law schools, like judicial education, people on corporate boards, people in climate action networks, to be able to be there, not necessarily because we know everything as Indigenous peoples, we know a little bit, but we might be able to point other folks to other folks who do have some of that knowledge and opportunity to pick that up. I see another question here is, what case do you refer to when you note intersocietal reconciliation? That word of intersocietal first came out in the Vanderpeet case in 1996. That's where it says a morally and politically defensible conception of Aboriginal rights will incorporate both legal perspectives. In the Mikisew Cree case, the treaty case, the first word and the first paragraphs are that reconciliation is the purpose of Section 35(1) of the Constitution. That is not a reconciliation that is just between humans for us. It's a reconciliation that is really much deeper than that, which is to try to find ways that we can involve ourselves with the world around us. And I think I've only got a minute left. I hear a question here from Sarah. How might we bring Canadian policymaking into Canadian policymaking, the voices and laws of Indigenous peoples from outside of Canada who are particularly vulnerable to climate harms, to bring greater attention to global climate justice impacts? That is a great question about global climate justice. Of course, a part of it is the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a global movement to do so. But it's also something that has to be verb-oriented. We have to find ways to support one another across those networks, as Tammy and Fenner are talking about in their presentations. And we do that through friendship and peace and respect and making treaties with one another, and also recognizing those traditions contain guidance about what to do with other natural features that surround us. So I see I'm out of time. Thank you, Amelia, for your question. It was wonderful to hear that. And thank you for the questions in the chat function here. And again, thank you for this invitation. It's just really wonderful to be with you today. And I really hope that this network that we're together in will see great action. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Bars and Amelia. It was a great presentation. And I think it was a great transition after Tammy's and Dr. Fenner's presentation about the different actors in the Canada Climate Policy Network. So we will, to conclude this conference, we will have this presentation about Canada's Climate Policy Network in practice. I'm very pleased to introduce you to the speaker. So first of all, we will welcome Arlene Strom, who has been with Suncor Energy for 18 years. She's the Chief Legal Officer, and General Counsel for Suncor. And then she will be joined by Rachel Sampson, who is the Research Director, Clean Growth of Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And she will be joined by Dr. Andrew Leach, who's an Associate Professor at the Alberta School of Business of the University of Alberta. And the discussant will be Nick Ettinger, who's a GD student at the University of Calgary. And before I let Arlene Strom start her presentation, I'd like to remind you that you can use the Q&A function to ask your question to the panelists. And at the end, we will have some time to answer those questions.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation about how we can collectively utilize our strengths and our capacity and resources to help provide energy for all while addressing the climate imperative. I'm coming to you today from Calgary, which is Treaty 7 territory. And in fact, I was born in the southeast corner of Alberta, which is also Treaty 7 territory. And I think, especially as I listened to Dr. Boros, for so many years, I was blind to truly seeing and learning from Indigenous people in the Treaty 7 territory. And now I am so grateful to the people who have lived for thousands of years on that land for their generosity and their incredible patience and spirit to help to be in relationship, to walk side by side, and I have learned so much. And I love the concept from Dr. Burrows about to take direction from the earth. I wrote it down as Nomake, as the Anishinaabe word, Anishinaabe law, which I really love. So as I started out, I'm glad to be part of this conversation. At Suncor, we have defined our purpose as providing energy that enhances people's lives while caring for each other and the earth. And so I'd like to focus my remarks on some of the lessons that we have learned over time through our journey, some aspects of what good governance looks like, and how an energy company that's focused in the oil sands can be part of climate solutions. So first, we have learned that deep engagement together with relationships matter. Why? Well, it helps us to discover our shared direction. Shortly after Suncor merged with Petro-Canada, that's 2009, going back a ways, I was at my first AGM in my new role as VP of Communication and Stakeholder and Aboriginal Relations. And Bruce Cox, who's no longer with us, but at the time was leading Greenpeace Canada, was coming to our AGM. And we did not know what to expect. About 6 months before that, Greenpeace had staged a protest, chaining themselves to some of our extraction equipment, and we were suing them. And so our CEO at the time, Rick George, who is also no longer with us, asked me at the time to set up a meeting with Bruce Cox. And at that meeting, I learned an important lesson. The two leaders met, and Rick opened the conversation by saying, Bruce, I am sure that 90% of our vision for our country, for our communities, for our family is in common. And so that's where they started. Now, the conversation, I'm not naive, the conversation went on to discuss some very difficult issues and disagreements. But from that point, the path forward in that relationship started to change. We dropped the lawsuit. We began meeting with Greenpeace twice a year. And during those meetings, we gained a better understanding of what was possible and where we might possibly have shared interests. Now, I believe those meetings were seeds that begin to germinate and help us in our vision to provide energy for all while dealing with climate. So if I can give a few other examples where perhaps the engagement gives a little easier and substantive outcomes. I've mentioned before in these types of conversations our engagements with shareholders. And we've had deep engagements with shareholders over the years who have helped us with our ambition, our sustainability goals. They've commented on our performance. They've commented on our reporting and on our disclosure, and been very helpful in sort of shaping our performance. So in about 2014, we were approached by one of our shareholders, NEI Investments, who asked about putting forward a shareholder resolution to enhance our climate disclosure. Fast forward, that resolution was adopted. We released a report on climate risk and our resilience. And we have continued to do that. We've also signed on to support the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We consider carbon risk a principal risk. It's reviewed regularly by our board now. All of these things were part of engagements and relationships that began through continued relationships with our shareholders. It's just very recently, our chair of our board and chair of our governance committee and chair of our EHS and Sustainable Development Committee met with a large group of shareholders to talk about climate risk and our performance and governance and a connection to executive pay and all these kinds of things. And it was a very constructive meeting. Our chairman and the two committee chairs that were at that meeting felt it was constructive. And so it's these kinds of relationships that we see as important. Industry collaboration is important too. I think of Evoke, which is a clean tech joint venture or clean tech venture capital that's out of BC. And this is something that we began with Synovus, each committing to invest $50 million over time in this clean technology. And just recently, we're considering a technology that came to Evoke that we consider so strategic that we're looking at it outside of Evoke. So it's these kinds of connections that help to foster opportunities. We've got actually lots of examples of collaborating with industry and government. One that we recently announced was a collaboration among Shell, the Quebec government, Suncor, and Enerchem, where together we're going to be building a renewable fuels facility in Varennes, Quebec. So all of these collaborations have in mind and help us take one step further towards, that energy for all while dealing with climate. So I also wanted to just make a few comments about good governance. We recently saw Larry Fink at BlackRock come out and talk about the importance of climate competence on boards. And so I think that's still a question that's undergoing. We see at Suncor a part of enhancing our climate competence, facilitating the right strategic conversations at the board level. And so one of the ways that we do that is through considering scenarios. We recently supplemented 3 scenarios that we have that are all focused on reducing emissions with a 2-degree scenario. And by reviewing the signposts and discussing these scenarios at our strategy sessions with our board, it's one of the factors that contributes to a deeper and more meaningful strategic discussion with our board. It's not really talking about, it helps us to not just talk about business as usual, but what decisions do we need to make to ensure that we have the right capital to invest in the energy transition while sustaining our current investments and improving the environmental footprint of those investments, both from a GHG perspective, a water perspective, a land perspective. So we're considering our own competence, our own assets, our own strategic advantage and capacity in all of these discussions. Another area that our board is currently working on and has disclosed is that they're continuing to consider strengthening the connection. We already connected, but strengthening the connection of our environmental, social, and governance performance into executive pay. So another piece of that governance evolution that we see as important. So with that, I just wanted to make a couple comments now about, I hope you're seeing how companies like Suncor can be part of contributing to the energy transition and contributing to climate solutions. When you think about our business, consider that we invest billions of dollars of capital each year. And in many ways, we are more like a manufacturing company than we are a typical exploration and production company of a conventional oil and gas. So we are well positioned to lower and offset the emissions from the infrastructure that we've invested in. And if we lower our capital costs, then we can have more capital to invest in the energy transition. We also see the relationship that we have with our Petro-Canada customers as a strategic one. We think about the electric highway. I don't know if we recently, I think it was probably a bit more than a year ago, installed electric charging stations in several of our Petro-Canada stations, so you can actually go travel across Canada and charge at those stations. So we see that as an important strategic lever, that relationship with our customers in continuing to reduce emissions. Another example this past year is we invested $76 million in Enerchem, which is a company that is turning garbage into fuel. And they have a pilot plant in Edmonton. And you may say, well, what does Suncor know about turning garbage into fuel? And actually, probably not that much. But what we do know is about operating big pots and pans. We know about refining. We know about operating these kinds of assets. And so in addition to the money that we've invested, we've seconded 12 of our folks, 12 of our operators into this pilot facility to help get the operations running efficiently and effectively. So these are just some of the ways that we can contribute to being part of Energy for All while dealing with the climate challenge. And I think that these themes are really important. We need to continue to collaborate. I loved listening to some of the things that John or Dr. Burrows was saying about how we impact one another. The blueberry pie metaphor is going to stick with me. How we do this work is so important. And I think there is a lot of opportunity if we continue to work together, collaborate, build on relationships, and focus on action. I would say the time and the imperative says it's time to invest that capital in technology, in businesses, in investments that actually reduce emissions. And so that's, I think, a way and a place where companies like Suncor can contribute significantly, because we can be part of that action. So with that, I will pause, and I believe Rachel is next.
Hello. I think I have some slides that are going to be starting. Thank you. So my name's Rachel Sampson, and I'm the Research Director for Clean Growth at Canada's Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And so I was asked to talk here today about my experience in a practical way with the Climate Policy Network in Canada. So I'll first explain a little bit of my background. I started my career in the federal government and worked for 15 years with the federal government on climate change policy for the most part, across 5 different federal departments: Natural Resources, the Privy Council Office, Finance Canada, Environmental Assessment Agency, and Environment Canada. So a number of different perspectives on climate policy. I then spent 5 years as a consultant, mainly working with the International Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development on the green growth research, as well as environmental performance reviews of OECD countries, including Canada in 2017. So also an outside perspective in. So one of the things, if you go to the next slide, one of the things that I wanted to highlight was the pros and cons of some of these interactions. And I'm going to focus on government and academia and government and industry. And I'll give 2 examples of my experiences in these, although you know, I have lots of different experiences over my career. On the academic side, when I was at Environment Canada, I was director of a group that led the creation of the academic engagement strategy for the department on the policy side, not science. And that strategy had 3 different components. One was a speaker series of bringing in some of leading thinkers on different issues to the department and broadcasting that to staff. Another one was establishing a research network that brought together some of the policy advisors with researchers working on the issues. And then the third was a visiting scholar initiative, and Andrew can speak more to that since he was our first visiting scholar at Environment Canada. The next example I'll give in terms of industry was when I first started my career in the federal government. It was in the late 90s, and it was right after the Chrétien government had signed the Kyoto Protocol. And they launched the National Climate Change Process, which was a series of sector tables that brought together industry, provincial governments, NGOs, academics, and lasted almost 2 years, I believe, covering a wide range of issues and debates and topics, and resulted in reports for each table. And the idea of that was to figure out how to meet the Kyoto targets. So within the context of these experiences, there can be significant benefits. So for governments working with academia, it can improve policy, it can improve decision-making, provide more evidence and analysis to make better choices. From an academic perspective, it can mean more policy relevant research. It can mean that the research that academics are doing is actually informing decision making. On the con side, though, I would say that sometimes being too involved with academics can lead you down some rabbit holes that, you know, there's always a continual need for more research, more analysis, more data in order to answer questions when, you know, at a point it reaches diminishing returns in terms of making decisions and moving forward. The other con that I've heard from an academic perspective is that real world policy problems are really messy and they don't often within a specific discipline make for a good publishable paper. So that can be a big challenge in terms of bringing together those objectives. On the government industry side, I would say when it works well, you can end up with some really innovative policy ideas that supports both industry success and achievement of climate policy objectives. And I'm hoping Andrew's going to speak to the output-based pricing system, which I think is a good example of that. The other thing it can do is government can play an important convening role in bringing together, in promoting industry collaboration. So both within an industry and between industries. For example, connecting some of the larger emitters with some emerging clean technology sectors, for example. But on the con side, I would say historically that a lot of the government processes with industry has focused on large incumbent players in the sector. And, you know, while that's important and positive, it can lead to favoring in incremental approaches and, you know, taking small steps as opposed to thinking about maybe some of the bigger and bold things that are now being talked about. And I've certainly heard from an industry perspective that, you know, government processes are not always loved in terms of the length of time and extensive involvement. And usually the big incumbent players are the ones that have the resources to be involved in those processes over some of the smaller players. Next slide, please. So what policy networks do we need to reach our climate policy objectives? And as Margot had showed earlier, this is a figure from a Climate Choices report recently released, looking at different pathways to reach net zero by 2050. And when we think about this, we think about all of the things that are involved in achieving this across so many different aspects of our economy and society. And that there are very specific challenges in here that are going to involve a lot of different groups. And some of the groups that have been historically left out of these conversations. So as has been mentioned, Indigenous peoples, but also youth as well, who are going to not only bear the brunt of climate change, but also be very implicated by how well we manage transition of our economy and society. Next slide, please. And we also should not forget the adaptation side of the equation. It's, you know, as we think about, we focus on reducing emissions, we're going to be dealing with the changing climate, increasing risks of wildfires and floods, heat waves that impact people. So we need to also have networks that focus on building that resilience across Canada to ensure that it doesn't unduly impact our economy or the well-being of people. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've started to think about at the Institute for Climate Choices in the context of clean growth is really looking at what are our shared objectives? You know, what if we had these shared goals that we could focus on solving those challenges? You know, not only how do we reduce emissions, but how do we reduce emissions while growing the economy? You know, how do we improve resilience while protecting the most vulnerable in society? So these sorts of shared questions can lead us to more productive places than maybe some of the historical conversations which have focused on the conflict between those objectives. Next slide, please. So when we looked across those 3 broad goals, we identified 11 main areas of intersection between economic growth, well-being, and climate change. And those focused on those challenges, the how do we achieve things together? So how do we reduce emissions and grow the economy? And we looked at the catalysts that would help get us there. So things like technology development, technology adoption, looking at trade and competitiveness, focusing on low carbon resilient infrastructure investment, and then the well-being aspects, that we can't forget people in this equation. We have to look at the jobs side of things, the affordable energy aspects, inclusive resilience, and how to get benefits in terms of clean air and ecosystems as well. So this sort of breaks down the problem into different challenges, and it may be helpful for the policy network to think about the different parts that need work across the different actors, as opposed to thinking of it as one big challenge. It's really multiple challenges that need to be addressed as we move forward. And within the context of the policy network, I'd like to highlight the approach that the Institute for Climate Choices is taking, because our whole structure is built around engaging with academia. We have expert panels for each of our 3 climate policy streams of mitigation, clean growth, and adaptation. And for each report that we do extensive engagement with industry, with Indigenous organizations, and provincial and federal governments. So we're trying to make those connections as we provide analysis and advice to improve government decision making. So with that, I'll pass it on to Andrew, and look forward to questions.
Well, thanks, Rachel. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Someone give me a thumbs up that you can. So as Rachel mentioned, that's one of the experiences I've had in the climate policy space is spending some time in Environment Canada. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about me and really 4 things that have shaped my piece of the Canadian Climate Policy Network, potentially 5. And then talk a little bit about when I think these types of networks work well and the circumstances under which maybe they don't. So for me, I think call it the 5 pieces of my life which have really shaped my engagement. The first was my academic place in the world. My initial job was at HEC Montréal, University of Montreal's Business School, where I taught energy and environment courses, but with a lot of focus on work in electricity and the Quebec space. I moved in 2006 to Alberta, which, for those of you that were not in Alberta in 2006, that was basically the peak of the boom, or at least the peak of the growth rate in the boom, the first oil sands boom. The Tim Hortons was paying signing bonuses, if you need a way to reconcile that. And I got thrown into teaching energy markets in an environment where almost everybody had been living in an immersion program for their entire life on energy markets, and I was thrown into the middle of it. But at the same time as that was going on, I was doing more policy work. I did some work for the National Roundtable around the Achieving 2050 agenda, then later more extensively around the Kyoto Protocol Implementation Act. As Rachel mentioned, I spent a year on sabbatical at Environment Canada, which remains probably one of the most valuable experiences of my academic career. And then in 2015, I had the opportunity to build climate policy for Rachel Notley's government through the Climate Leadership Panel in Alberta. And that led to the imposition of an economy-wide carbon tax in Alberta, made me the most hated person in Alberta, and also developed what became now is the output-based pricing system in the Pan-Canadian Framework / Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. Kind of came from our policy work there as well, I think. And so through my experience in those, I think there are times when these networks or gatherings of people work really well. And I decided to think about what are the things that make those processes work well, and then what are the points at which they're strained. And I came to 3 big functions that I think are almost necessary conditions. The first is clarity of purpose. The second is existence of a challenge function. And the third one is transparency in the methods. And so let me talk about each of those in turn. So when I say clarity of purpose, I think, Rachel mentioned the sector tables that were around in the lead up to Kyoto. That was, it was almost a free endpoint problem. There was we'd never really done this before. We didn't know where we were headed. We had no record of process really around this. And it was kind of like choose your own adventure. Where do we want to go? Everybody's saying their piece, and it wasn't really clear what we were trying to get to. You know, achieving 2050 with the roundtable is maybe a more direct path. We had a national target. We said, how are we going to meet this? And I think that's one of the things that you've seen work well around, I think our process in Alberta to a degree was, you know, define a new climate change policy for Alberta, but we had a very clear purpose, clear timelines, clear metrics that we had to meet, that then we brought people together around that, as opposed to the larger abstract problem of, you know, how do we deal with climate change as a relatively small part of a global economy and a global open economy, with very different interests from different people around the table. So I think clarity of purpose is key. So if we're talking about bringing a network of people together, what is it that network, what's that network's goal? And if you can't write that goal down in a couple of sentences, maybe you need to rethink of where we're headed. The second thing, which I learned partly from my time in Environment Canada, and I think we executed really well in Alberta, was in any kind of formalized process, the importance of transparency, the importance of people putting sort of their cards on the table and having a mechanism to do that, and a mechanism to be called to account if they don't. And so what do I mean by that? In Alberta, we had a simple rule around our climate panel, which was, sure, you can submit anything to us that you want. It's just going to be posted publicly on a Google Drive site. You can come and make a presentation of the panel. You're just going to do it in front of a room full of 25 people. And everything you say is sort of on the record and open for discussion. And what that meant was that you could not have people making one presentation to decision makers, one presentation to NGOs, and one presentation to the media and saying subtly different things. And what it did, I think, for us, and what I think why I'm bringing this forward here, is to say, you know, one of the foundations for any kind of a network is that we all at least trust each other, that we're saying to each other what we would say to somebody else about the same policy problem. And so the transparency in deliverables, data, analysis, et cetera, is a way of holding everybody to account for that. And I used to have a stock response. People would tell me, and you get this all the time still as an academic, you know, I could give you much better information if you would sign a non-disclosure agreement. If you'd let me provide you this information sort of behind closed doors, you'll do better analysis. To which my stock response was, and still is, you know, absolutely, as long as you'll sign an agreement not to comment on the results. And the reason why I always use that is because it sets people up to say, you know what, I don't want to be on an uneven playing field with you. I don't want you to be able to go out publicly and say something that contradicts what you've said to me behind closed doors, and yet I'm sitting here with a signed agreement that means I can't contradict you. The last thing is put people in front of a challenge function. Make people uncomfortable, but only welcome people who are willing to move their position. So having people who are enabled and assigned a particular party line that they have to defend, there's of no use in a room. So you need people at a high enough level that they can make a decision that will move the dial. And whether that's an NGO position, whether that's a corporate position, et cetera, having people in the rooms who have a mandate to move the dial is crucial. So I think in evaluating the network, as Fenner's doing, putting the diagrams around it, you know, I think you need people who are at the key levels, and you need to evaluate, are people able to engage on a level with each other, and are they able to do so honestly? The last thing that I'll bring forward, and you know, I think this is maybe a change. Every time I get a chance to do something new, I change some of my views on things. So I used to have this pretty strong view that, you know, we're economists, we live in our kind of bubble because we understand economics, we understand policy. And over the last year, I had a chance to go back to school. I guess it's pretty much been a year now since I finished most of my in-person classes, but I went back to school and did a master's in law. And one of the things that I realized in doing that was how important an understanding of somebody outside of our something outside of our usual discipline is. So when we think about it, we've got a Supreme Court decision coming up probably next week on the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. But what that decision through an economist lens is going to do is it is going to define the constraints on policy design that apply to the next generation of people who are going to be doing what I've done. right? The people who are going to be doing what Rachel's done and advising deputy ministers, and the people who are going to be doing what Arlene's done, which is going forward and saying, what are the key policy risks to my company, and how can I position my company to be successful in there? What the Supreme Court ruling is going to do is sort of define the goalposts for the federal government, or define the sidelines, I guess, for the federal government. And we're going to have to say, with our own disciplinary hats on, what's the best way to go forward for policy, from policy purpose? What's the best advice to give to federal and provincial politicians about policy direction? But also, and again, from the corporate world, how do we take this and formulate it into corporate strategy? And so I think that does maybe open up the doors to some of what I've talked about. When we have that ruling come through from the Supreme Court next week, it may be a major or partial reset in terms of the policy landscape. And it's going to give us, along with our Paris targets and our 2050 goals, those clear endpoints. So it gives us that clarity of purpose that I talked about. Now, the question is, can we bring people together? And I still think the roundtable's Achieving 2050 process stands out as a potential sort of high watermark for some of this engagement that we've had up till now, as a sort of bringing all of these parties to bear in a transparent way around a common goal, without quite having the same pressure that was on us, for example, in Alberta with the climate panel and timelines and such. So I'll leave it at that. I see Margot saying the ruling's coming down this week. I know they've asked for comments about media lockup conditions. So yeah, whether it's this week or next, I don't know, but I don't think they've announced a press date. So it's Wednesday. I don't know if I would expect probably you'll see it Monday. I think they'll give more than a day's notice to media and such. So anyway, guess we'll see what happens.
Thanks so much for that. I'm Nick Ettinger. I'm a law student at the University of Calgary. And I just wanted to first of all thank Andrew Leach, Rachel Sampson, and Arlene Strom for their perspectives today. This conference has been all about connecting Canada's climate policy network, the different scalars of which Dr. Fenner-Stewart introduced earlier, being governmental, industry, and civil society. And I think what better way to round off today's conference than hearing from different actors within those multiscalars. And so my question, I want to get right into the question and answer period as we're winding down. But my first question for the three panelists would be, what is one thing that each of you would like to see change to enable better connectedness and or cooperation among the policy network within Canada? Maybe we can start with Arlene.
I get to go first twice. Well, thanks for the question, Nick. I was going to focus my comments on what I think we need to do, maybe using a bit of metaphor around a pressure cooker. I mean, we need significant change in order to continue to make progress in this area. And I think, you need enough pressure within the pressure cooker to make things happen, to cook too much and it blows up, not enough and nothing happens. And so as I think about, how we think about one another, and I must admit, I was really struck by Dr. Borro's comments about the connection among us. How our actions impact one another. Are we going to throw stones at one another, or are we going to provide incentives and encourage one another to take action in this space? And so I think the one thing is to really think about our impact on one another and to use that as our guide to take action.
Thanks, Arlene. Maybe we could hear from Rachel next.
Sure. I mean, in my experience in terms of when these things have worked really well, I think, as Andrew said, is when there is sort of a defined question that needs to be solved, but it's also the individuals involved. It really matters to find the right people. It's the people who are willing to roll up their sleeves, who are willing to listen to other views and other perspectives and other disciplines, who who don't have an entrenched interest in terms of the outcome. They actually are willing to think about the broad possibilities of solution and work together to achieve it. And those people are rare. So it's finding those people and putting them together in the same room to solve the challenge.
Well, nice to have 3 of those people speaking right now. Dr. Leach, any perspective?
You know, I just listening to Rachel got me thinking about, you know, one of my favorite people in this space was Rick Heinemann. When Rick, for those of you that don't know Rick, he was CAP's climate change advisor, his PhD in economics. Brilliant guy, unfortunately taken too soon by cancer. And Rick also was crucial in getting me into this space. But you know, I think it's trite to say, but almost, you know, if I could have one thing, it would probably have been to bring him back, because of the degree to which he was able to, I think, bring different perspectives together, whether it was the sort of CAP table in Calgary or the university audience in Montreal or what have you. And I think that's an incredibly valuable skill that not a lot of people have. And, you know, so the value of having that connection. And then, you know, if I had a magic wand that didn't involve that, I think it would be to make a whole lot of internal discussions around this topic more clear. And Arlene sort of, I think, soft pedaled the degree to which Suncor has set the table for this, but it has done, Suncor has done a great job, right? Go into their sustainability report. There's a couple of phrases in there that say things like, you know, action on climate change could mean we don't build any new oil sands projects. That's one of Canada's largest companies coming forward and saying our growth plans are on the table here. That takes a lot to do that. That's a lot of leadership right from the top to change that and to have that discussion that's been going on for years internally, to bring it forward and put it in the public eye. And the more we can do that, the better. So there's a question on the line about disclosure. And I think that's where we have to get to. We have to get to the fact that companies are not having these discussions simply behind the scenes, that they're disclosing in a transparent way where they actually think the world is headed and why.
Andrew, can I build on that? Because there was also a question that somebody asked about, you know, why are you putting in applications for growth projects? And, you know, your comments on how we evaluate our scenarios in our climate risk report is, you know, just brings to light the tension there. And part of the reason is because the process takes a very, very long time. And so, you know, as we think about the technology window, as we think about the need for these projects or not, replacing some of the current production that we have, then we have to apply for it early. But in the meantime, we know we have a lot of work to do on reducing our emissions, on reducing our footprint, on developing new technology, and determining where that capital should best be spent as we're looking at that, you know, long-term trajectory. I also think it's one of the things that we lose sight of. Corporations, yes, we have quarterly reports, but with the amount of capital that we're investing, we're looking at things over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And sometimes it's hard for governments to do that. I saw one of the participants asked about, you know, what can we get through the political system in terms of policy? Well, corporations have an ability to look at the long term. And so I just wanted to try and answer a couple questions in response to the comments that you made as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Eileen.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Sonia to take over the rest of the Q&A. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Thank you for your thoughtful question, and Rachel, Andrew, and Arlene for your presentation. So you've kind of touched upon like one of the questions, which was about companies, if they should disclose their climate-related risk. And so we've heard about Andrew's perspective and Arlene, but I'd be curious if like Rachel has something to add on that. And the following question that the person asked was, is Canada losing out on attracting ESG-focused investment dollars without a framework?
Do you want me to answer that one? Sure. I mean, disclosure is actually something that our institute is diving into, and we're looking at some of the considerations around that and doing some modeling relating to that. And certainly it seems that Canada probably has a unique perspective on disclosure that is not being well reflected in the current discussion that is very European centric. And a lot of the disclosure discussion seems to be quite qualitative, as opposed to looking at quantitative metrics that could actually allow for transparent comparison across companies. So those are the sorts of areas that we're diving into and starting to think about what we really should report. And not just on climate change as well, because I think as we're talking about how we do transition, I'm very excited by some of the effort that's going on by the First Nations Major Project Coalition, for example, around ESG metrics that better reflect Indigenous issues and concerns. So, that this full environmental social governance reporting actually really reflects where Canada wants to go.
Thank you. So we have like 1 minute left. I don't know if any of you have like another last comment before we pass it on to Dr. Fenner.
I want to jump in on the end of Rachel's there if I can. I definitely agreed with the emphasis on ESG. And one of the things that's come out in the last couple of days here in Alberta is the government's new sort of ESG focus. And while I think it's really important, I worry that we're starting to see a return to some of the discussion we had years ago around sort of ethical oil and branding and labeling and these sorts of things now we can use the ESG trends as a way to kind of rehash those same discussions. And that really concerns me when you see people immediately jump to the marketing aspect as opposed to what I think is the better way to frame it, which is investor protection, consumer protection, economic risk analysis or systemic risk analysis, like we do with, securities and reserve declarations and prospectus and these types of standards, that's the frame you need it under. You don't need it as part of a marketing campaign, but as an investor protection measure.
And I just wanted to address one other question that came up very quickly, and it was about Indigenous engagement and how do we reconcile, some opposing voices within Indigenous communities around development of pipelines or infrastructure. And what I can comment on is we see that engagement. It's not just consultation; it's engagement and relationship. We have equity partnerships with Indigenous communities. We continue to learn from Indigenous communities. We have an Indigenous Youth Advisory Council that we're learning from that are representative of communities across the country. It's not perfect. Do we have more work to do? Sure, but this is critical, and we've put a lot of effort into relationships and the kind of equity partnerships with Indigenous communities that are impacted by energy development. So thanks for that opportunity.
Thank you, Arlene, for wrapping it up and making the link with Dr. Barrow's presentation. So thank you everyone for this panel. So that concludes it. So I will just pass it to Dr. Stewart.
Thank you so much. I thought that today went well. I put this together, and I for one am pleased with the outcome. We've introduced some of the current issues facing climate policy. We've provided a glimpse at Canada's climate policy network through the lens of governance theory, and took a quick look at what some of the next phases of this project will be. We demonstrated the power of indigenous knowledge and how it could be better employed to help guide climate action moving forward. And our final panel, it offered some examples of what Canada's climate policy network looks like from the ground and some important insights from that perspective. I hope that you all enjoyed this as well. I would like to provide some thanks. I'd like to first of all thank all the panelists for their time today in sharing their insights with us. I'd also like to thank Janice. Janice has been a incredible mentor to me, but an incredible mentor to many, many people, young scholars in Canada. I'm not a young scholar anymore, but yeah, and she was instrumental in this conference, but also in putting together this project. I also would like to thank Javaria, Sonia Lee, and Charles, who this conference would not have occurred without their important contribution. As far as institutional support, I'd like to thank the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, the Canada Climate Law Initiative, the Center for Business Law at the University of British Columbia, the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, the University of Calgary, the University of British Columbia, and last but not least, the University of Oxford. As a final note, this conference has been recorded and will be available in both video and text format. As mentioned, this is only the first phase of the project, and additional outputs from future phases will also be available free to the public in the future. So thank you very much for joining us today, and have a good afternoon.